Becomes like a fleeting memory. Whatever you grab just turns to dust. Like eye contact with a stranger in a crowded room is a dream bending into a real. The passing note of a song, the glimmer of the shifting sea. You think you saw it, you think you see it.
Okay, without getting into the weeds of the psychological perch that I do think dismantles the idea of determinism.
Well, I think, yeah.
So I think that when I listened to his free will book, I noticed a certain amount of darkness settling in on me. Because if I consider the possibility of that, there's something really enticing about that. Mm-hmm. The world is deterministic. Whatever it is that I'm struggling with right now, what to do in my relationship, whether or not to have another smoke when I quit or whatever. It's like if I just say, well, I live in a deterministic world, I have no power over this. So I would ultimately resolve myself to my most immediate basic wants.
Well, not necessarily. It's like, because it might be where you overcome those things, and you were determined to do that. But still, it doesn't really matter. So it could be like, like he uses the thing about eating. I think there's an example.
The dieting example. Oh, okay, yeah. Let's talk about this one.
Yeah. So so the lady or the person was, dieting, and they at first they try and then they fail, but they try again later on and they sort of succeeded, and there was nothing that they could have done about it one way or the other.
He says just that it was just that the first time you just didn't have access to the right books and ideas, and the second time you did, which is it's a compelling story to tell.
But it doesn't really matter.
Well, my argument against that is that everyone knows that's not what happened.
Yeah.
What happened was that the first time that the lady dieted, in her deepest, darkest self, she said, I don't want to diet anymore.
Yeah.
I think that's what happens.
Yeah. You don't really want it.
You don't really want it.
Yeah.
And I think you can want something 99% and still choose against it. Mm-hmm. And your deepest shame exists in that as well. Mm-hmm. And you can say, well, I guess Sam would say, well, that 1% deep, dark part of you hadn't read the right book. Mm-hmm.
Or there's a certain amount
and
of information.
I think, though, that shame that's in the 1% says, no, it had nothing to do with books. Mm-hmm. It was me. I didn't want to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think,
But to play out the deterministic point of view, there would be no point in considering that or thinking about that. There would be no point in going on the diet in the first place.
Well, it wouldn't really matter. The deterministic point is that you would either go on the diet and succeed, or you would go on the diet and you wouldn't succeed. But it's already going to happen as it will. So success or failure is not.
If I'm sitting at any point in life and say to myself, I should go on a diet, my arrival at that thought was outside of my control. And so my next thought after thinking I should go on a diet, generally people who think I want to do anything that's hard, that's against some of my baser instincts. The next thought is, if I want to change the outcome of those instincts, the next thought is some amount of stress or fear, like it's going to be hard. I don't know if I really want to do it enough to succeed. And you start interacting with that. And so if I live in a deterministic world, then there's no point in feeling all of that. So if I really subscribe to the idea, then the next time I experience that stress and fear, then I just say, no need. I don't need to feel it.
But see, again, I think that's why it's so hard to truly give yourself to this even to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's really, really, really difficult because even the way we're talking about it, we're giving agency and possibilities, and and I think that's the thing that you can't really accept a deterministic world truly. And anybody who talks about it in that
agree.
way,
Unless
you're a complete nihilist.
Well, I do think that's where it goes.
But nihilist, not necessarily everything turns out bad, but just that.
I agree with you.
Doesn't matter.
I don't think that anybody can be deemed to be living their life in a way that demonstrates that they believe that the world is deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to try, I wonder what the outcome would be. I think that's the thought process I'm trying to go down. Well, not in a deterministic world. Like this,
see, it
breaks down so quickly. But I want to follow this. Like, if I say, you know what, I really like this idea of determinism, I'm going with it.
Yeah.
Everything is outside of my control. The idea that I have neurons firing in my brain that give me some concept of control is an illusion. It's an accident. Just like everything else, things are going to happen how they happen.
But it's weird because you're using a narrative now, which is. So,
you're right. Because
I want you to keep going with this.
Right, but even my thought process is saying I will plan for how things will happen in a deterministic world, but planning negates determinism.
And ultimately, and that was Brett's point, ultimately, you have to say it doesn't matter. I mean, that's just kind of where determinism ends.
It's nihilism.
It's nihilism, but and again, it's not even nihilism in, like, most people think of nihilism as like let it all burn or it's all bad type thing. But nihilism is also in the sense of it could turn out all good. You are the richest person in the world and you have, you're so happy and you do all these things. Or you could be in middle America and be so happy. And, it's like, but it's just, there is just no meaning to it. And you have no agency in that coming to fruition. And so it's like, and that was the point I think Brett kept pushing on, and Sam would just halt it and then go full determinism and then flow back into this sort of freedom, this free will, this observation, this I feel, I perceive. So he couldn't do it either.
Well, that's the interesting thing is it's like he wants to reconcile his own existence with some fabricated picture of what he wants things to be like. He wants to say the world's deterministic, and I got to figure out how to fit my life into that.
Yeah.
Whereas
that's what it seems like.
There is no world outside of your life. I don't think it's like you can't separate those two things.
Well, it's so much cleaner. It's so much easier. I think for me, when I hear him arguing that, I feel like it just simplifies everything for him. And it's so much nicer to see that.
Yeah.
And so where he tries to keep the free will, although he won't call it that, is this sort of psychological component and this observational part. So he kind of gets to keep himself in a sense in this determinist. So it's like, because I think that's the thing, is like he's found that he can't fit his life into this deterministic part, this deterministic outlook. And I think that's probably why the meditation, like he's really big on meditation right now, and this sort of observing yourself. And so I think that's sort of the reaction to that determinist, because it doesn't fit, to be logically consistent with a deterministic outlook.
I mean, ultimately, reality and consciousness itself is confounding. It's frustrating, and also the most exciting thing that you've ever experienced.
Well, I think that's the safest position is there are certain aspects that are determined. How much we don't know. We have a certain amount of agency, free will. How much we don't know. And somewhere in that spectrum is where we function. And it could be said that some people have more agency and less agency.
Give me an example of two people who have more and less agency.
It'd be very anecdotal, but I'll try to. Well, I think of when you read I really want to give more of a. Of actual specific examples. None come to my mind, so I have to kind of make up something, okay. make up a scenario or a story. But you can kind of see the story of somebody who has kind of grown up in a place where they've been ignored. Their parents really haven't invested in them, didn't show them the love and affection that they may need. And when they were at school, not being familiar with what love and affection and healthy relationships are like, having no examples of that, have hard time connecting with other people, and that's the story that they believe and has been demonstrated, and they don't know any different. Because they haven't had that example of somebody who said, no, it doesn't have to be this way. Let's learn some skills. Hi, my name is Sarah. My name is Joe. What's your name? Simple skills like that. That sounds so ridiculous.
It doesn't, though. That isn't even a simple skill. Like introducing yourself to someone.
Yeah, totally.
Even people who were brought up to introduce themselves well still struggle with that.
But, so you have that aspect where, I think the way that we're raising our kids is, there's a lot of possibility out there. What do you want to do? Okay, well, how do you want to go about that? Can you do that? That there's this engagement of getting someone to think about what is possible. Oh, wait a minute. Again, that's the whole idea of teaching too, is broadening somebody's ideas of what is possible and how you fit into this grand narrative that you've sort of been born into, that you know nothing about. You don't know about what happened in the 60s with, women's rights and, all the way back to, slavery to,
right.
The emancipation.
And as much as you read about it, as much as you learn about it, you will never have experienced it. So there will always be information that is lost to you.
Yeah. But there's something about that.
But you will inherit something that is new to you.
Yeah.
That wasn't exactly true then. All of that gets forged into something that you inherit, which is net different.
Well, it's something like even
what was lived
us
through.
in the U.S. is we live. I think it was 1890. People lived on 90% of people lived on less than $1 a day. That's ridiculous.
It's lower than the absolute poverty rate now.
Yeah. And we can't even comprehend that.
Well, this is why I say that narrative is ultimately a creative force.
Oh yeah.
Because you don't get to live the past before you were born, but you get to inherit the morals of it. And that becomes this massive store of power that you use to push forward. And I don't think we really understand that power.
Well, you think about it too.
Yet it does end up being exponential. Even over the last 130 years, we have drastically changed the world almost without trying. The majority of us are doing just what it is we can do. We're just, getting up and trying to make it through the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we are standing on the shoulders, or I want to say it a different way. We are being carried forward by a tidal wave of power. And while we can't control it completely, we do add to it. And to the extent that we decide what we add to it, we change it.
But you think about all the powerful narratives. I mean, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. You know, I mean, that narrative that he gave at that time was just so powerful, and it was so inclusive. And it broke down the barriers between men and women, different skin colors, different religions. You know, it's like that narrative was so powerful and so uniting. Yeah. And, you know, even Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, live wins out. You know, you're coming from a communist occupied, I guess you can probably use that word for, you know, Czechoslovakia and then become Czech Republic. Yeah. And he's got this slogan, love wins out. And everyone thought that was ridiculous.
I took this great picture when I was in
the
Czech Republic a couple years ago of a monument to him that has that.
Yeah. But it was ridiculous. Like people did not believe him because they were used to the government making them go to different events and to sort of wave flags for certain things. And so when you have this playwright, you know, as president now, and he's building this narrative, but he's building a narrative to a broken people that don't trust this person that's wanting to build a different narrative. Yeah. But when he died, you saw that narrative take over, you know? I mean, for the most part, I mean, obviously it's a lot more complicated than that, but just the shift from like the early 90s and 80s to present day is pretty huge. There's some really, but narrative is hugely powerful. The narratives that you believe have such a huge effect. If you believe everybody's out to get you, you know, whether it is like a power hungry money person, you know, everyone's after my money. And so you have to protect. And that's a narrative that you have.
The narrative that you have, or the narrative you believe, is much more, has a much greater effect on your life than any fact that you might be able to attempt to set outside of it.
Totally. Yeah. Oh yeah. Narrative has a greater effect than any sort of fact, I would believe. Yeah. How you fit. Yeah. I'm about to say how you fit the facts into your narrative.
I'm just wondering how somebody could dismantle that argument. And I think you could fairly easily, but
I'll do it. Yeah. I mean, there's certain.
Well, I could tell myself. So somebody could say, "Well, okay, tell yourself a story about what cyanide is and how it affects your body, and then eat some."
Oh yeah. Well, I think that's really great because there's this thing that always sticks in my head. It's like reality will always catch up to you. It's like if I think I'm invincible and I go and step in front of a car, I'm going to get run over. Like there's a certain there's this check. Reality checks you. You know, even in your you know, whether, but again, you start getting these religious terms too, which is funny. Like before we had all the science that we had is sort of pride, vanity. It's like, there's these checks that happen that check your narrative.
That's true. And I guess this is what I describe as the larger narrative, which is how do you conceptualize those checks? You conceptualize them as sins. You conceptualize them as poisons. Do you conceptualize them as some force of gravity, perhaps?
Natural law.
And I guess that's ultimately why I say that everything is narrative, because things only are to you what they are based upon the story in which they exist.
Yeah, and there's some, and I think that's the part of reality is it won't allow you to tell certain stories. Like Sam's deterministic story. You know, it's like what I saw in that podcast was that reality would not let Sam tell that story. And he even used the language and felt that pressure that reality was saying, this story is not true. You're trying to work around that story and you can make it sound somewhat true, but it's still, and I felt that's what I felt from that whole podcast was, and I felt Brett was trying to kind of push it out just a little bit further, but Sam wouldn't allow that. He wouldn't go there. The meaning part, the teleos, you know, it's like every time it kind of like, as Sam was pushing out into it, and then Brett was going to take it out a little bit further and define exactly where Sam was going, then Sam would just back into his fortress.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the part we can be really careful of is when we're looking at the narratives that we believe and that the narratives that we're telling is whenever you bump into something to take notice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we tell better stories when we're conscious of the fact that we're telling a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you think about it too. I mean, our kids are continually that. You know, we bump our story and our kids are sort of like, no. You're like, well, no. I'm the dad and you do what I tell you to do. No.
That's not a good story. I don't like that story.
I don't like that story.
Yeah.
No. This is the story. All
Try
right?
again, Dad.
Try again. You know, and it's a check. It's like, oh, something's there's conflict here, and there's something wrong with the story that I'm saying. Is that you say what you do, what I tell you to do. Okay, what's wrong here? And so then your story gets checked, and you have to learn a different story. Like, oh, they're actually having a really hard time at school right now, and they're reacting to me in this way. Or
when you become aware of some element of the larger story that you weren't previously taking into account.
Yeah. Or right now they're really trying to find their boundaries, and they need to actually bump up against me because I'm safe, and they need to be able to bump up against me and understand that I'm safe. You know, so that narrative can be a lot of, but you have to, when we bump into those conflicts and the narratives that we understand and see, it's I think that's where we have to like dig deeper into, oh, why is that, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's such an interesting thing. The why. Why is it that way? So I can either look at the why is it that way question and say, well, that supports the idea of narrative, which supports the idea of agency and supports the idea of free will. But I also think Sam would say, you don't have free will because what you just did, well, why did you do what you just did? Because of some previous cause. And why did that cause arrive? It's the effect of some previous cause. So his asking why leads him to determinism, whereas my asking why leads me to a narrative structure in which I have agency.
Yeah. And that agency...
Why is that? What's the difference?
Well, I think... But when you say you have agency too, you also see that your agency is restricted in certain respects. The no from your kid, or you know, some other part too. So there's certain restrictions, but you're going forward with the idea that you have some sort of agency. You know, it might be to dig a little bit deeper, and then you have more agency because you have more knowledge of that situation, and so that you can make a shift in your narrative in order to meet that specific need. But okay, so for me, I want to give Sam a different favorable outlook.
Good. I think that's deserved.
Well, okay, so I don't believe, if I were just to, because he does run the deterministic line really hard. So I'm going to take that away from him, and more what I hear him saying is that there's all this stuff that is happening, and I feel like the most is like he is watching and observing these things happen, and that he might not call it agency. He would say that he has no effect on outcomes, but he is an observer of what is happening. And that's I think that's as far as you can go with his argument for determinism. So it's still determined, everything, but he has an agency that's not free will, but it's an observation of all that is coming to fruition.
So all that is a movie that's already been shot that is playing out.
Yeah.
That cannot be changed. The only exception is that I get to watch it and think something about it.
Yeah. And that maybe it would change my experience of what is already playing out.
But
I know.
Isn't your experience necessarily a part of what's playing out?
But I'm trying to give him the favorable part. But it's sort of as the person in the movie theater is not the person in the act. So it's like, golly, it's so horrible. It's almost like I think maybe to put it in like a really bad terms, it's like if you were the murderer and you were murdering somebody, you could sit back and watch that, but you're watching it happen. You are not that participant that's doing those things. I mean, I feel like that's sort of an extreme example of what he's saying.
I feel like that's a sociopathic.
Oh, it is.
Perspective to take. It's like I don't have to feel any empathy or guilt because that's not me. I'm just watching me.
Yeah, but I think that is what he's saying.
I think that there are people who feel that or experience that.
Yeah,
but that's not the vast majority of us.
Well, we
are not free from guilt and empathy.
Well, see, I'm taking it. That was a really bad example, and I mean not the bad example, but the horrific example of what he's talking about. But
isn't that the same?
Well, no, he's thinking of it in a way of sort of life is unfolding, and there's unfortunate things that happen, and I'm observing these things. So he's kind of more thinking it from like maybe like a normal quotations life, in that you're observing that, because he would say like, well, maybe that killer had a tumor or child stuff, and it's like all these things that
child stuff.
Yeah, child.
Who
stuff.
doesn't have child stuff?
I know. Well, some people have worse, but like but yeah, it doesn't really work. I mean, I think that's the part that we keep bumping up against.
That's the problem to me, though, is like even if you say, okay, Hitler has a tumor, and that explains all of his behavior. Well, what good does that do?
Yeah.
That doesn't say that someone who doesn't have a tumor doesn't have free will.
Well, he would say that he mentioned this in, I don't know which one it was, but that you would lock that person up. Like that, but even then it's talking about
as a deterrent.
Agency. I know, as a deterrent. Like you would lock that person up, you'd go to war with that person. But again, he keeps stepping out into the...
But then there are people who have tumors that don't commit genocide. So it's like we're getting into a Minority Report situation in which you have judgment and agency. And so you've already
I think that's the thing.
Gotten outside the box.
His viewpoint, you can't go there. It's basically, I mean, it's you are observing and that's it. And so everything else is as it is,
except for your judgment of it.
Yeah, possibly you could throw judgment in there, but you have no agency in changing outcomes. So you could be sitting back here watching the movie and being like, oh, well, that was stupid. Oh, that's not good. But that fits the spectrum of evil killer Hitler, which is always easy to use, to Mother Teresa. Any one of those people are sitting back in their movie theater and watching what is unfolding. And we both don't agree, or that there's more agency involved. But I think outside of, because he doesn't go full determinism, I feel like that's the closest that you could give him. Outside of, although he continues to move into agency, which completely does away with determinism. So I feel like that's as far as you can go, as sort of everybody's sitting in a movie theater of their life, and they might be able to make judgments and thoughts about what's happening, but it has no impact on what's going to unfold. And I agree, he doesn't allow that to happen.
Yeah, which I think would be true if you spent all of your time from that removed perch.
What do you mean?
Well, you sit outside of life and watch it unfold. And we all I think, can relate to that.
Yeah.
What it's like to watch ourselves do something.
Yeah, totally.
Right? But
Like,
we don't exist
that?
100% in that space.
No.
And I think it is in the times that we experience meaning that we come down from that place and enter into ourselves and act in the world.
Yeah.
In a way that is not inconsequential.
Or even, I would even say there's parts when we act outside of like really being in ourselves. Because there's parts when you are in yourself and you're acting, and it's a moment, almost like a flow state kind of thing, where everything goes, it kind of glimmers or shimmers or whatever people will say about it.
And even in that state, you can kind of separate out and be like, oh my God, look at me.
Totally. And then there's other parts where it's like you're doing something and you're like, whoa, look at that. But you can see how the decisions or the things from your past have led to this very thing. So, but again, we're talking about a sort of a marriage of, circumstances and agency, and then some conglomeration of the two. Wow, I just looked at Peterson. He was like,
what was that little hand motion you did?
I don't know. Peterson always does this. Like, yeah, that's. I think that's a part too. It's like how can we be like, I don't know if we want to go here just yet, but how can we be, I want to say, lead actors in our story, or be more engaged in our story, but also the story of this life? I think that's the part that is most fascinating to me. And I think both you and I are really interested in that. It's like, what are the narratives? What is the narrative? How does that fit with this world that we live in? I think that's because we both see, to some degree, in some variation of there, we have agency. We also see how we are also confined in some ways too. I don't know. I mean, that might be too big of a question to throw out right now to you, but like how do you take that when you look forward with what you have versus, and also with what you already are confined by, not necessarily good or bad, but just there's certain confines, but then you also have an agency to project into the future.
Well, I think that we all have some concept of not what life would be like, but who it is that we might be, what sort of character we might be in some future state of the world. If we were to fulfill the potential that we suspect that we have.
Yeah.
And every morning we get up and we sense that. We sense who that character is, and we sense the gap between who we are and who that is. And then we either choose to wrestle with that or we don't.
Yeah.
And when we choose to wrestle with it, to struggle with it and say, you know what, who I am right now doesn't match that thing that I sense the person that I sense that I might be. And so I'm going to do the best that I can to articulate the gap. And then look around me at my environment and say, what can I do within this environment, within this day, within the restrictions of this day, to try to close that gap. And that's a wrestling process.
And also who's modeling that gap. You know, I think when we think about, you know, the people that are around us, the biographies that we read historically, you know, as we see different models of that narrative and like how we engage the world. Like, so for me, like, you know, the possibility. So I like believing that everybody has that agency to be more than what they are, but they're also good. They're also, I'm trying to figure out how to say this like in a way that I mean it is like where they are is good, but they can't stay that place. It's like there's something good about where you are right now, but you can't stay there. If that makes sense. Does it make sense?
Yeah, because no one can stay where they are. However good or bad the position you're in, you don't get to stay.
Yeah. So that's the thing with narrative, you know, so, you know, we have, you know, your Judeo-Christian narratives, your Islamic narratives, Buddhist narratives, community narratives, you know, so it's like, what is it that, I guess for me is like, what is the most unifying narrative and true narrative that when you bump up against something, it tests those narratives. And so that's the part that I'm most interested is bumping up against and figuring out what breaks and what doesn't break. And there's some things I know that are from what I read is that it just don't work, you know? You know, like a Hitler type thing, like white nationalist, you know, Aryan race type stuff. That doesn't work. We've learned that, you know, the Gulag, the Russians, you know, it's like where, you know, it's like there's these things that you see that just don't work. And so what does work? What brings people, the greatest number of people together and that kind of stuff. So
I'm struggling to scope that.
Yeah.
That proposition.
How so?
Well, so when you talk about bumping up against something, I think about children. I think about my children. And they're constantly bumping up against you, like purposefully. They're trying to define the limits of their world. You know, it's like, do I get to roll the window down in the car? Yes? Okay. Do I get to stick my hand out? Yes. Do I get to stick my head out? Maybe. Do I get to climb all the way out and sit on the edge? You know, it's like, where's the limit? I'm pushing for the limit. But then when you frame that sort of bumping up against the narrative in the larger context of all of humanity,
Yeah.
what's the scope of sort of the moral of the story you're trying to tell?
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. It's like, it's
like
something
for the kid, it's like, don't die. But for all of humanity, is it the least number of people dying? Is it like, what's the metric?
Well, it's almost, that's hard. That's really difficult because I don't know if you can, I don't think dying, that's like a really great, not dying is a great, not having like genocides. And that's a great thing, you know. But like, I don't know. So I think where you're getting at is really good in that, you know, because I feel like whatever happens on the micro is also applicable on the macro. So when you're talking about your kids, or my kids too, it's like you give them a certain amount of limits, but then as they grow and mature and show responsibility, they have more freedom.
Right.
So you have to have a society which governs that in a way,
which imposes limits, but also awards freedoms.
Mm-hmm. So the more responsible you are with that, you become more free. Or, you know, like the less responsible you are with your freedom, you have more limits. I think that happens in general, just not even, you know, whether you want to call it natural law or whatever. You know, it's like the more the more you deceive and lie, the less people will trust you, and you're limited in relationship and help because you're very untrustworthy. Right. So you're restricted just through social interaction. So you see something with lying and cheating that restrict, but there's also something about being, you know, it's like as you become more, you know, maybe with giving or helping other people, but it's not just in helping and giving to other people, but it's knowing in the right amounts at the right time, which develops sort of wisdom, which gives you more freedom, because you also know that, you know, you can't just go give someone $1 million off the street because they wouldn't know how to use that $1 million. Like for me, like Michael with 1 Medici versus Michael with 7 Medicis, I would not know how to manage what I'm doing right now.
Right, but you could give someone on the street $1 million.
Yeah, you could, but it's not responsible. We think about like all the people who won the lottery.
Not responsible, you know? Because there are better ways to spend $1 million. Is that your point?
Well, it's part of the point. I mean, if you think of the lottery, like most of the people who, I mean, it's like a huge, like 90% of people who win the lottery go broke within the next 3 to 5 years or something like that. And that's not a hard and fast fact, but it's a huge number of people.
Right.
So if you don't have you haven't developed the responsibility to be able to handle, or haven't developed the.
I think it's a truism. It's like you don't know how to handle what you haven't earned, because you don't understand what you haven't earned.
Yeah,
because you don't understand things based upon data points. You understand things based upon experience.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I see it definitely with Medici specifically, like running one store versus running 7. It's not it's not something that I would have been able to do very well.
Well, because it's not 7 times 1.
Well, just to be able to build the infrastructure and to know how to relate to different people and to manage managers that manage staff, and you know, it's there's different levels where it's like when I was doing just West Lynn, I was everything from plumber to manager to barista, you know. So but I don't know, maybe we're too far off on where we're going with it. But I don't know, maybe we should kind of wrap up where we're at with all this.
I think that's probably a good idea. It's feeling like the appropriate wrap up time.
Yeah.
So I will say there's a couple of things I'd like to bring forward in the thread of our conversation.
Okay.
One is the idea of meaning and how seemingly to me fundamental that is to our experience of reality. I want to talk more about that.
Okay.
Another is something that we didn't actually talk about, but the whole beginning of the Brett and Sam podcast, the first 30 minutes at least, was about lying. And we did mention it, but there's a lot to be talked about on the concept of lying.
Yeah.
So I'd love to bring that forward.
I'd have to read his book because I'm really interested in what he is.
Yeah.
I think I can kind of grasp what he's getting at there, but
I'd like to read the book too. I'd like to gather some different perspectives on it, because to me the idea of lying is something of a conundrum. Not in that I don't know what to make of it, but in that I don't exactly know why I make what I make of it.
Okay. That might be too much to get into right now, though.
Definitely. No, I'm saying like this is a thread I want to pull forward.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
And I think I'd like to. I have a guest in mind to bring on for a lying conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. Any concepts from this conversation that you'd like to pull forward?
Yeah. I think narrative for me is something which is also meaning too.
Yeah.
It's like, I think meaning and narrative are very hand in hand, and the stories that you believe or we believe and I believe and how they shape your reality. I think that's more impactful than any, kind of like what you were getting at, is facts. Is what is the narrative and what is the meaning of those things that you orient your life around. I think that has huge impact. If you believe something about other people or yourself or society in general, that has a huge impact on how you interact with the world.
Much more than anything you perceive as fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good one.
But, and also I also want to reiterate, like Matt and I totally really enjoy Sam and Brett, and even though we're really, but that's the thing I love about Sam is he puts his ideas out there and he's going to be criticized. But I think it's really brave to be as outward as he is with that. And it helps me think through this, to see that struggle and that, it's like, even though I might be like, you're not doing it with that. But I really do appreciate somebody doing that, putting those ideas out there. So.
Yeah. He seems to me to be honestly having the conversation.
Yes.
Which I think is why I feel free to criticize it, because he's honestly having it.
Yeah.
And this is why it's a conversation worth having, and why Sam is the public figure he is.
Yeah.
And I respect that.
And I would love to hear more from Brett. Like, I know he was interviewing Sam, but I would love to hear, because he was wanting to go into this next part as far as like how free are we?
Yeah, at the beginning
Even
he
if
was
it's
like, can we just
illusion?
put determinism aside and then have a great conversation? And he never got to have that conversation.
Yeah. And it was interesting too, because Brett was wanting to, and that's the part I was really interested in, is basically he was talking about how the language of free will is probably not good. And so I saw him wanting to, like, as the same idea of 300 years ago, we didn't have the language of evolution to describe where we came from and what has come, how things have kind of unfolded. And so I felt like he was taking the same idea with free will, is sort of, we don't have the language for free will. That my stomach's all growling. But we don't have the language. So I kind of felt like he was making that analogy to evolution, to this discussion of determinism and free will. And so I was really curious where he wanted to take that.
Yeah. What if we did an episode under those pretenses?
What do you mean?
Well, we've agreed that arguing determinism is pointless. What should you do in a world which is not completely deterministic?
Yeah, I think you and I are already in that space,
We kind of just had it.
Yeah, we kind of just had it, but I think that will unfold. I think like or as we're talking about threads, I think that like the meaning, narrative, and also how free are we, and also understanding our limitations.
Yeah.
I think that has also been a thread through our conversations, and I think that's really hard to know your limitations. Or even acknowledge limitations, not necessarily that they have to continue to be a limitation, but then also where we actually are free and we have agency in areas that maybe we're not taking, we're not grabbing onto. So, yeah.
I could just launch into another thing, but let's leave that one. Agency in, how did you say it? Agency in
structure. I don't know. It was really great though.
Agency in places that we're not aware of yet. That is the potential that I think fuels our most positive life experiences. It is the gap between who we feel we might be and who we experience ourselves to be.
That's good, yeah.
So let's pick that up sometime.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, that was fun.
That was. Yeah. Thanks for coming along with us.
I'm really curious like how this unfolds, like how this conversation, like you and I think we were really stretched in this conversation.
I felt that.
And if you guys feel that, it's probably because Matt and we're stretched. We're really working through this and trying to understand, giving Sam his due and really trying to understand his perspective and Brett's. So I don't know. I felt pretty stretched. Was trying to like grab onto these things that I don't have. I don't feel like I have as.
That's the place we intended to go.
Exactly. Yeah. So there we are.
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. All right. Well, thank you guys. Is there anything else we need to say?
Nope. See you next time.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you guys. Bye.